The photograph landed on the desk. Chris Hemsworth's face completely changed. His eyes closed, and he began crying silently. And Jimmy Fallon had to stop the show. It was April 2024. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Studio 6B at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. Another Thursday night. Another A-list celebrity interview. Chris Hemsworth, Marvel superstar, action hero, one of the biggest names in Hollywood, was scheduled to promote his latest film. The audience was buzzing with excitement. Chris had walked out to thunderous applause, that million-dollar smile lighting up the stage. He'd hugged Jimmy, waved to the crowd, settled into the guest chair with the easy confidence of someone who'd done 1,000 interviews. Everything was going perfectly. Jimmy cracked jokes. Chris laughed. They talked about his new movie, his kids, a funny story about his dog. The Roots played bumper music. The cameras captured every angle. It was textbook late-night television. Entertaining, light, exactly what viewers expected at 11:35 p.m. And then, 7 minutes into the interview, a production assistant walked onto the stage. This never happened. PAs didn't interrupt live tapings. They didn't walk into camera shots. They definitely didn't approach the host's desk during an interview. But this one did. She carried a manila envelope. She walked straight to Jimmy's desk, leaned down, whispered something in his ear, and handed him the envelope before quickly exiting frame. Jimmy looked confused. He glanced at Chris, who shrugged, equally puzzled. The audience murmured. This wasn't part of the show. Jimmy opened the envelope and pulled out a photograph. An old one, the kind printed on thick photo paper from decades ago, edges slightly yellowed, colors faded but still clear. He looked at it for 3 seconds. His expression shifted, confusion morphing into recognition, then shock, then something deeper. He looked up at Chris. "Chris," Jimmy said, his voice different now, missing its usual playful energy. "I need to show you something. Someone in our audience tonight brought this, and they said you need to see it." Chris smiled uncertainly. "Okay. What is it?" Jimmy stood up, unusual for him during interviews, and walked around his desk. He approached Chris's chair and held out the photograph. Chris took it casually, still smiling, probably expecting some funny throwback picture or embarrassing childhood photo that would get a laugh. He looked down at the image, and everything stopped. A photograph was placed on the desk and Chris Hemsworth's face completely transformed. He closed his eyes and began silently crying, and Jimmy Fallon had to stop the show. Chris's smile vanished. His jaw clenched. His eyes, those famously bright blue eyes that had stared down villains in a dozen action films, filled with tears. His hand holding the photograph began trembling. He tried to speak. His mouth opened. No sound came out. He looked down, bowing his head, bringing his free hand up to cover his eyes. His shoulders shook with a silent sob. The audience fell into confused, worried silence. 300 people leaning forward, trying to understand what they were witnessing. The Roots stopped their soft background music mid-note. Questlove's drumsticks froze in the air. Jimmy stood beside Chris's chair, one hand on his shoulder, looking genuinely shocked and concerned. He glanced at the cameras, then at his producers offstage, then back at Chris. "Chris," Jimmy said gently. "You okay, buddy?" Chris shook his head, still not looking up, still holding that photograph like it weighed 1,000 pounds. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, cracking with emotion. "Where did you get this?" To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened 16 years earlier. Chris Hemsworth wasn't always Chris Hemsworth, global movie star and household name. In 2008, he was a struggling actor from Australia trying to make it in Hollywood. He'd had small roles on Australian television, a brief stint on a soap opera, but nothing that translated to American success. He was broke. Living in a tiny apartment in Los Angeles with his brother Liam, also trying to make it as an actor. They shared rent, shared groceries, shared the constant anxiety of auditions that led nowhere and callbacks that never came. Chris had been in Los Angeles for 8 months and was seriously considering going back to Australia. The money was running out. The rejections were piling up. His work visa was expiring. Every audition felt like his last chance, and every thanks but no thanks felt like confirmation he didn't belong. His agent called one morning in March 2008. "I got you an audition. It's a big one. Marvel. They're casting Thor." Chris barely knew who Thor was. He researched frantically, learned the comics, studied mythology, prepared for days. The audition was everything he had left, his final shot before admitting defeat and buying a plane ticket home. The night before the audition, Chris couldn't sleep. He sat in his cramped apartment, staring at the audition sides, paralyzed with anxiety. Every line he practiced sounded wrong. Every character choice felt forced. He was going to blow it. He could feel it. At 2 a.m., his phone rang. An international number. Australia. It was his grandfather, Robert Hemsworth. Chris called him Pop. A retired mechanic from Melbourne who'd raised Chris and his brothers through countless summers when their parents worked long hours. Pop was 76, gruff, practical, not given to sentimentality or long-distance phone calls in the middle of the night. "Chris, your mother told me about your audition tomorrow." "Pop, it's 2 a.m. here. You didn't have to." "Shut up and listen," Pop said, his voice rough but warm. "I want to tell you something." Chris listened. "When I was your age, I wanted to be a boxer. Thought I was good enough for the pros. Trained every day. Had one shot at a real promoter watching me fight. You know what happened?" "What?" "I got knocked out in the second round. Flat on my back. Career over before it started." Chris didn't understand. "Pop, that's not really helping. I'm not done. I spent 40 years fixing cars, thinking I'd failed. But you know what I figured out? I didn't fail because I got knocked down. I failed because I never got back up to try something else. I let that one moment define everything that came after." There was a pause. Chris heard his grandfather take a breath. "Tomorrow, you're going to walk into that room and give them everything you've got. And maybe they'll say yes. Maybe they'll say no. But Chris, and I need you to hear this, you're not going to let their answer define whether you keep fighting. You understand me? You get knocked down, you get back up. That's the only rule that matters." Chris felt tears on his face, sitting alone in his dark apartment, holding the phone to his ear. "I'm scared, Pop," he admitted, his voice breaking. "What if I'm not good enough? Then you're not good enough for that room. But you might be good enough for the next room, or the room after that. You don't stop trying just because one door closes. You hear me?" "I hear you." "Good. Now get some sleep." "And Chris?" "Yeah? I'm proud of you. No matter what happens tomorrow." Chris went to the audition the next morning. He was still terrified. Still certain he'd fail. But he walked in with his grandfather's words playing in his head on repeat. "You get knocked down, you get back up." He auditioned. He gave everything he had. 3 weeks later, his agent called. "Chris, you're not going to believe this. They want you to audition again. Final round. You're in consideration for Thor." 4 auditions later, Chris Hemsworth got the role that would change his life forever. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Chris never forgot that phone call. That 2 a.m. conversation with his grandfather became the foundation of everything that followed. When Marvel movies made him famous, when he became one of the biggest stars in the world, when success started feeling overwhelming, he'd think about Pop's words. "You get knocked down, you get back up." He talked to his grandfather every week after that. No matter where he was filming, Australia, America, Europe, he'd find time to call Pop. They'd talk about family, about life, about everything except fame and movies because Pop didn't care about any of that. He cared about whether Chris was happy, whether he was treating people right, whether he was still the same kid who used to help him fix cars in the garage. In 2019, Pop was diagnosed with lung cancer. Stage 4. The doctors gave him months, maybe a year with treatment. Chris flew home to Melbourne immediately. He spent every day he could at Pop's bedside, holding his hand, telling him stories, reading to him when Pop was too tired to talk. One afternoon, 3 months before Pop died, Chris asked him, "Do you remember that phone call? The night before my Thor audition?" Pop smiled weakly. "Best call I ever made. You saved my career that night. You know that, right?" "I didn't save anything," Pop said, his voice thin and tired. "I just reminded you what you already knew. You were always strong enough, Chris. You just needed to believe it." Chris pulled out his phone and took a picture of his grandfather lying in that hospital bed, not to share publicly, not for social media, but for himself. A reminder that the strongest person he'd ever known wasn't a superhero or movie star. It was a 76-year-old mechanic who'd called him at 2 a.m. to tell him to get back up. Pop died 2 weeks later. Chris gave the eulogy at his funeral, breaking down multiple times, unable to finish sentences. He told the story of that phone call. He told everyone assembled that every ounce of success he'd achieved existed because one old man believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. Chris never showed that hospital photo to anyone. It lived in a locked folder on his phone, too personal and painful to look at most days. He carried his grief privately, the way his grandfather had taught him to carry everything, with quiet strength, without complaint, just keep moving forward. Until tonight. April 2024. When somehow, and possibly, that photograph appeared on the Tonight Show stage. Behind the scenes, Jimmy made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Chris was still looking down at the photograph, still crying silently, his hand trembling. Jimmy crouched beside the guest chair, his own eyes glistening with tears he was barely holding back. "Chris," Jimmy said softly, "someone in our audience tonight brought this to our production team. They said you need to see it. And they said there's something else." Chris finally looked up, his face wet with tears, mascara smudged from wiping his eyes. "What? What else?" Jimmy gestured to someone off stage. The cameras followed his movement. An elderly woman stood up from the third row of the audience. She was maybe in her 70s, wearing a simple floral dress, her white hair pulled back neatly. She looked nervous, emotional, like she was about to do something terrifying. Chris stared at her, confusion mixing with his grief. Who is that?" The woman's voice carried across the suddenly silent studio, shaking but clear. "My name is Margaret Chin. I was your grandfather's nurse. In Melbourne." At the end, Chris's hands gripped the arms of his chair. "You were there?" "I was there for his last 3 months," Margaret said, tears running down her face now too. "I saw you visit every day. I watched you hold his hand. I heard him tell stories about you when you weren't there. Mr. Hemsworth, your grandfather was the kindest patient I ever cared for." Jimmy stood up, giving Margaret space to speak, his producer instincts warring with his empathy. He made a split-second decision, and gestured for Margaret to come to the stage. The audience held its breath as the elderly woman made her way down the aisle, and onto the stage. Chris stood up, photographs still clutched in his hand. Margaret reached into her cardigan pocket, and pulled out an envelope. "Before your grandfather died, he wrote you a letter. He made me promise to deliver it if I ever got the chance. He said, if my grandson ever doubts himself again, give him this." Chris took the letter with shaking hands. His voice broke. "He wrote this for me?" "He wrote it the day after you visited and told him you felt like you weren't good enough. Like the success was too much. He wanted you to remember what he told you that night in 2008. Chris opened the letter. His eyes scanned the first line, and he completely broke down. Jimmy put his arm around Chris's shoulders as the superhero sobbed on live television. Through tears, Chris read aloud. "You get knocked down, you get back up. That's still the only rule that matters. I'm so proud of you. Pop! The studio erupted. Standing ovation. Jimmy was crying. Margaret was crying. Questlove was crying. 300 strangers witnessing the moment when strength and vulnerability became the same thing. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Chris framed the letter and photograph together. They hang in his home gym where he trains for every role. Before every major audition, every big premiere, every moment of doubt, he looks at them. Pop's words still getting him back up.